It started with one of Jessica's usual pitches. Her eyes sparkled as she slid the glossy brochure across the kitchen counter one evening. The Monroe Resort, it read. A luxurious retreat nestled on a secluded island in the Florida Keys, complete with ocean views, infinity pools, and high-end restaurants that catered to the rich and famous. Her excitement was palpable, but I was skeptical. "We need this, Michael," she said, her voice hopeful, but carrying an edge I recognized too well. The edge that told me she'd already made up her mind. I glanced at the pamphlet, flipping through the pages as she leaned in closer. "It's for work," she added, softening her tone. "The design firm is working on their new wing. They've invited us for the opening weekend, all expenses paid." Jessica had a way of making her work sound like the key to everything. Her firm was always pushing her into high-profile projects, and she loved the attention it brought. To be fair, she was excellent at what she did. Her eye for detail had made her one of the most sought-after interior designers in Austin. But I couldn't ignore the growing distance between us, the late nights, the constant phone calls, and the way she'd retreat into her work more and more each week. "It'll give us time to reconnect," she continued, as if reading my thoughts. "You've been swamped with the launch at the firm, and I've been so buried in this project. This could be exactly what we need." What we needed. Those words tasted strange, as if they'd grown unfamiliar between us. It wasn't the first time she had suggested we needed time away together, but this offer felt different. Less about us, more about showing off her success. Still, I couldn't deny the thought of a break sounded appealing. Running a tech company specializing in cybersecurity solutions wasn't exactly a 9-to-5. My own work had become a tidal wave of stress recently, and maybe, just maybe, this could be a brief escape from the grind. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of her expectations heavy in the air. "All right," I said, feigning nonchalance. "Let's go." Her eyes lit up with excitement. "Great. You won't regret it." "I hope not," I thought, already feeling the tug of something unsettling. Jessica smiled, kissed me on the cheek, and started planning the details, but I noticed she was more focused on her phone than on me. The conversation quickly shifted back to the resort, her newest project, the clients, the prestige, leaving little room for us to actually talk. We left Austin early on a Thursday morning. Jessica, of course, had planned everything down to the last detail. The flight was smooth, and I tried to shake off the sense of foreboding as we landed in the tropical heat. The Monroe Resort was exactly as the brochure promised, lush, private, dripping with luxury. Palms swayed gently in the breeze as we checked into our suite, a sprawling ocean view room with a balcony that practically kissed the sea. As we settled in, I tried to focus on relaxing. Jessica seemed happy, but something about the way she moved around the suite made me feel like a guest rather than her husband. She unpacked quickly, moving through the room like she was rehearsing for a presentation rather than preparing for a romantic getaway. I watched her, silent, my thoughts churning in the background. This wasn't going to be a simple vacation. The first night, we met them, Paul and Amanda. Dinner at the resort's high-end restaurant was booked solid, but Jessica, with her impeccable connections, had managed to score us a table. As we were about to sit down, a man called out from across the room. "I noticed you were looking for a seat," he said, striding toward us with a confident smile. "Paul," he introduced himself, extending his hand. "And this is my wife, Amanda." He was about my height, maybe a few years older, but built like a man who spent more time on the golf course than behind a desk. Amanda, on the other hand, was stunning in a subtle, almost effortless way. Dark hair, tan skin, dressed in a sleek black dress that clung to her in all the right places. She smiled, but there was something calculating behind her eyes. Jessica returned Paul's smile with one of her own, a little too bright, a little too eager. "I'm Jessica," she said, glancing at me quickly. "This is my husband, Michael." "We were just about to sit down," Paul continued, "but there's plenty of room at our table if you'd like to join us. No sense dining alone, right?" Jessica's gaze flicked to me, her smile still in place. "What do you think, Michael?" I shrugged, playing along, though I couldn't ignore the undercurrent between Paul and Jessica. Something about him was off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it yet. "Sure," I said, forcing a grin. "Let's join them." We moved to their table, and as soon as we sat down, the conversation flowed easily, maybe too easily. Paul and Amanda were charming, no doubt about it. They talked about their life in Houston, Paul's success as the owner of several luxury car dealerships, Amanda's wellness brand that had blown up on Instagram, and their love for lavish vacations like this. Paul was slick, too slick, I realized as the night wore on. He had a way of commanding the conversation, leaning in just a little too close to Jessica, his compliments always just a bit too personal. And Jessica, she was soaking it all up. Her laughter came more frequently, her posture more relaxed. I watched her closely, noting every subtle glance she sent in his direction. Amanda, on the other hand, focused most of her attention on me, though her attempts at flirting were more subdued. She played with her wine glass, asking me about my company, our life in Austin, and whether we traveled often. The whole evening felt like a game, one I hadn't agreed to play, but found myself trapped in nonetheless. As the night stretched on, Paul ordered after-dinner drinks, toasting to new friends in unexpected places. His eyes lingered on Jessica as he raised his glass, and she didn't look away. I kept my face neutral, not wanting to show my hand too early. I wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but there was something about Paul, about the way Jessica was responding to him, that set my instincts on edge. After dessert, Paul suggested checking out the nightclub at the resort. Jessica smiled at me, her eyes sparkling like they used to when we first started dating. It could be fun, she said. What do you think? I nodded, pretending to be as lighthearted as she seemed. Sure, let's see what this place has to offer. The nightclub was packed, the music loud, and the drinks flowing. Paul, naturally, had connections, and a table opened up for us as soon as we arrived. He and Jessica hit the dance floor almost immediately, leaving Amanda and me at the table. I sipped my drink, watching them through the crowd. Paul was getting close, too close for my liking, but I didn't react. Not yet. What do you think of them? Amanda's voice cut through my thoughts. I turned to her, noting the way she leaned in a little too much. They're interesting, I said, keeping my tone neutral. She smiled, her eyes scanning my face. Yeah, I think we're going to get along just fine. There was something in her voice, something that made my skin crawl. The night dragged on, and by the time we returned to our room, I was more exhausted mentally than physically. Jessica collapsed onto the bed, laughing about how much fun she'd had. Paul's a character, isn't he? She asked, turning to look at me, her smile still lingering. Yeah, I said, my voice flat. He's something. Jessica didn't seem to notice the edge in my tone. She stretched out, her eyes heavy with sleep. I think we're going to have a great weekend, she murmured before drifting off. I lay beside her, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The night had revealed more than I'd expected. Jessica's flirtation with Paul wasn't something I could ignore, but instead of confronting her, I let it simmer. The morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains, casting a soft glow over the room. Jessica was still asleep beside me, her breathing steady, her face peaceful in the early light. I lay there for a moment, thinking about the night before, about Paul's lingering eyes and Jessica's laughter. Too free, too unguarded. Something was off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it yet. I wasn't the type to make accusations without proof, but my gut was telling me to stay alert. A knock on the door broke the quiet, and I slid out of bed, careful not to wake Jessica. I opened the door to find Paul standing there, already dressed in casual fishing gear, a crisp white polo, sunglasses perched on his head, and an easy smile on his face. "Morning, Michael," he said, his voice a little too cheerful for the hour. "How about we take that boat out for some deep-sea fishing?" I paused, glancing back at Jessica, who stirred slightly but didn't wake. I wasn't sure if I wanted to spend more time with Paul, but declining would raise questions. Besides, if I wanted to keep an eye on him, this was the perfect opportunity. "Sure," I said, grabbing a shirt from the chair. "Give me a minute." Paul waited outside while I got dressed. By the time we were heading out, Jessica had just begun to wake. I leaned over the bed and kissed her cheek, noticing how she smiled at the touch, still half asleep. "Fishing with Paul," I said softly. "You and Amanda can relax by the pool." She nodded sleepily, mumbling something about getting a spa treatment later. As I left the room, I caught the faint scent of her perfume still lingering in the air, mixing with the salt of the ocean breeze as we stepped outside. The morning was warm, the kind of heat that hadn't yet become oppressive. Paul led the way to the dock, where a sleek fishing boat waited, already prepared. He handed me a beer as we boarded, a casual gesture that somehow felt more calculated. I accepted it, leaning against the railing as the boat eased away from the shore. As we cruised out into the open water, the conversation started innocently enough. Paul talked about his business, selling high-end cars to Houston's elite, and his various investments. I listened, though my mind was elsewhere, keeping tabs on the undercurrent of our interaction. He was laying it on thick, subtly bragging about his wealth, the private jets, the houses in multiple states. It was the kind of talk that was meant to impress, but I'd heard it all before. I wasn't here to be impressed. I was here to listen. "So, what about you?" Paul asked after a while, reeling in his line to adjust the bait. "Running a tech firm must be pretty intense. A lot of pressure, right?" "Comes with the territory," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "But I enjoy it." Paul nodded, casting his line again. "Yeah, I get that. I mean, life's too short not to enjoy what you do, right? That's why Amanda and I try to live as freely as we can. No point in sticking to the old-fashioned rules if you don't have to." I turned slightly, watching him closely. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, a casual movement, but there was something deliberate in the way he said, "We like to keep things open. Keep things interesting." He smiled, the kind of smile that was meant to seem innocent, but I wasn't fooled. This wasn't just casual conversation anymore. "Interesting how?" I asked, playing dumb, though I already knew where he was going with this. Paul chuckled. "Well, I don't like to put labels on things, but Amanda and we're not exactly what you'd call traditional. We found that life's a lot more fun when you don't limit yourself, I didn't respond right away, taking a long sip of my beer instead. So this was his angle. He was testing the waters, seeing how I'd react, trying to gauge whether Jessica and I might be open to more than just casual dinners and conversation. I glanced out at the water, keeping my voice calm. "That works for you too?" Paul laughed, leaning back against the boat's railing. "Absolutely. We've met some really great people over the years. Some of them have become close friends." The implication hung in the air between us, thick and heavy. I felt my jaw clench slightly, but I didn't let it show. Paul was trying to lead me somewhere, and for now, I'd let him think he had control. What he didn't know was that I was already one step ahead. "And Jessica?" Paul asked, as casually as if he were asking about the weather. "She seems pretty open-minded. I bet she'd enjoy having a little fun with us." I felt a sharp flicker of anger flare up inside me, but I kept it buried deep. "Jessica's her own person," I said carefully. "She makes her own decisions." Paul smiled, satisfied, as if I'd just given him permission. But I hadn't. Not even close. The rest of the fishing trip went by uneventfully, though Paul kept up his usual banter, alternating between talking about his wealth and dropping subtle hints about the kind of lifestyle he and Amanda enjoyed. By the time we headed back to shore, I knew exactly what his game was. Jessica and I were being sized up, tested, and from the way Paul had spoken about her, I had no doubt that he was already planning his next move. But I wasn't going to let him make the first play. I was going to stay ahead of him and of Jessica. When we got back to the resort, Paul invited me to lunch, but I politely declined, saying I had to meet Jessica. He didn't seem bothered by it, giving me a wink as he headed off in the opposite direction. I found Jessica and Amanda lounging by the infinity pool, both of them sipping cocktails and laughing about something I couldn't hear. Amanda looked up as I approached, her smile widening. "How was the fishing?" she asked, her voice light, but her eyes were sharp. She was sizing me up too, I realized. This whole weekend was one big test. "Relaxing," I said, pulling up a chair next to Jessica. "Catch anything interesting?" Jessica grinned, glancing over at Amanda. "Nothing like what we've been talking about," she teased. I raised an eyebrow. "Oh." Amanda leaned forward slightly, her gaze flicking between Jessica and me. "We've just been having some girl talk. About life, relationships, keeping things fresh." The way she said it made my stomach twist. It was the same line Paul had been feeding me on the boat, but hearing it from Amanda only confirmed what I already suspected. "That right?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. Jessica looked at me, her smile still in place, but there was a flicker of something else behind her eyes. Amanda was telling me about how she and Paul like to experiment sometimes. Try new things with other couples. I stared at her for a long moment, letting her words sink in. This was it, the moment where everything shifted. Jessica didn't sound shocked or disturbed by the idea. If anything, she seemed intrigued. And that's when I knew Paul had already gotten to her, planted the seed. Amanda watched us closely, her smile never wavering. "It's not for everyone," she said, her tone as smooth as silk. "But I think you two could really enjoy it. You're both such a strong couple, after all." I didn't respond. I simply leaned back in my chair, processing everything, thinking about the conversation on the boat, the way Paul had tried to nudge me into this twisted game. I realized now that it wasn't just about Paul trying to seduce Jessica. It was about control. He wanted to see if he could push us into his world, see if he could break down the boundaries between us. But I wasn't going to let him. I turned to Jessica, keeping my voice steady. "Let's get some lunch. I'm starving." Jessica looked surprised but nodded. "Sure." As we walked away from the pool, Amanda's gaze followed us, and I could feel her satisfaction radiating behind us. She thought she had planted the idea, set the wheels in motion. But what she didn't know was that the game had already begun, and I wasn't going to lose. Jessica walked beside me, unaware of the calculations running through my mind. She thought this was just another conversation, just another suggestion. But I knew better. I knew this was the start of something bigger, something that could shatter everything if I didn't stay ahead of it. The sun had long set, leaving a lingering warmth in the night air as Jessica and I made our way to Paul and Amanda's cottage. The resort was quiet, with only the distant murmur of waves and the occasional clink of glasses from the bar by the beach. Jessica was walking slightly ahead of me, her steps light, and her energy noticeably brighter than it had been in weeks. I followed, eyes scanning the path ahead, but mind racing, replaying the day's conversations over and over. Paul had made his intentions clear, not through words, but through every subtle gesture, every glance, every seemingly innocuous comment. He was testing boundaries, pushing to see how far he could go. And Jessica, well, she wasn't blind to it. She had smiled at him more today than she had smiled at me in months, and that alone was enough to stoke a quiet fire in my chest. But I wasn't about to let things spiral out of control. Not on his terms. The cottage came into view, the soft glow of candlelight flickering from within. Paul and Amanda were already waiting for us on the porch, a bottle of wine between them and 4 glasses lined up like an invitation neither of them expected us to refuse. Amanda waved us over, her smile wide and knowing, as if we'd just walked into her trap and she was eager to see how we'd react. "Well, there they are," Paul called out as we approached, his voice smooth, almost too welcoming. "We were beginning to think you'd gotten lost." "Not at all," I replied, keeping my tone light. "Just taking our time." Jessica settled into the chair next to Amanda, the two of them already deep in conversation as Paul handed me a glass of wine. I took it but kept my distance, leaning against the porch railing, watching the 3 of them as if I were the outsider here. Paul had made it his mission to be the host, pouring drinks, making jokes, drawing Jessica into his orbit with ease. After the second round of wine, Paul turned to me, his eyes gleaming with that familiar predatory spark I'd seen all day. We were talking earlier," he began, his voice dropping into that smooth, practiced tone, "about how nice it is to meet a couple who's as open-minded as you two seem to be." Jessica glanced at me quickly, almost nervously, but said nothing. I held Paul's gaze, waiting. "Have you two ever considered exploring other options?" he asked, the words deliberate, as if each one was crafted to test my reaction. Keeping things fresh like Amanda and I do. There it was, the offer I'd been waiting for, though hearing it out loud still sent a surge of anger through me. I'd seen it coming all night, but that didn't make it any easier to swallow. Paul leaned in, his smile widening as if he already knew the answer. I didn't blink. "No," I said firmly, without hesitation. "That's not something we're interested in." Jessica shifted uncomfortably in her chair, and I didn't miss the brief flash of disappointment in her eyes. Paul's smile faltered for just a second, then returned, smooth as ever. "Well, that's understandable," he said, leaning back in his seat, acting as if nothing had happened. "Just thought I'd put it out there. No harm in asking, right?" I shrugged, keeping my face neutral. "No harm," I echoed, though my jaw clenched slightly as I spoke. I could feel Jessica's gaze on me, but I didn't turn to meet it. An awkward silence settled over the group, but Amanda was quick to fill it, steering the conversation back to safer waters. I stayed quiet, observing, calculating. Paul had made his move, but it wasn't going to end here. I could sense it. The night wasn't over yet. After another hour of forced laughter and half-hearted small talk, I caught Jessica's eye and gave her a look that said we should go. She hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "We should probably call it a night," she said, standing up slowly, though there was a reluctance in her movement that didn't escape me. Paul, ever the gracious host, stood as well. Of course," he said, though there was something unreadable in his eyes as he looked between us. "Thanks for coming by." Amanda gave us a warm smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. As we turned to leave, I felt Jessica's hand brush against mine, but I didn't take it. We walked in silence back to our room, the warm, humid air hanging heavy between us. Once inside the suite, Jessica headed straight for the bathroom, her movements sharp, almost tense. I watched her go, my mind buzzing with everything that had happened over the past few hours. The way she had reacted to Paul's suggestion, there was something there, something she wasn't saying. But I had said no, made it clear where I stood. Surely that was the end of it. I lay in bed later that night, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the sound of the waves in the distance. Jessica slipped into bed beside me without a word, her back to me as she pulled the covers up over her shoulder. The silence between us was thick, but I didn't push it. We'd talk in the morning, maybe, when everything wasn't so raw. Sleep came eventually, though it was restless and broken by half-formed dreams of things I didn't want to admit to myself. When I woke the next morning, the sun was already creeping through the curtains, filling the room with light. I reached over instinctively, but my hand found only empty sheets. I sat up quickly, glancing around the room, but Jessica was gone. The bathroom door was open, the room silent except for the faint sound of the ocean outside. "Jessica?" I called out, though I already knew she wasn't there. I glanced at the clock. 8:30 a.m. She'd been gone for a while. A cold knot formed in my stomach as I grabbed my phone. Without thinking, I dialed Amanda. It rang twice before her familiar, cheerful voice answered. "Morning, Michael," she said brightly. "What's up?" "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm just looking for Jessica. She wasn't here when I woke up. Have you seen her?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a casual, almost dismissive laugh. "Oh, she's with Paul. She came by early this morning. They're probably still at our cottage." For a moment, I couldn't speak, the world going silent around me. My pulse quickened, and my grip tightened around the phone. "She's with Paul." Amanda replied, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Didn't she tell you? She stopped by just after sunrise. Said she needed to talk to him about something. They've been catching up since." My blood ran cold. I didn't bother to respond. There was nothing left to say to Amanda. I hung up and immediately grabbed my shirt from the back of the chair, throwing it on as I headed for the door. My mind raced as I crossed the resort grounds, my feet moving faster with each step. By the time I reached Paul and Amanda's cottage, I could feel the heat rising in my chest, my hands clenched in a fist at my sides. The door was slightly ajar, and without thinking, I pushed it open and stepped inside. I knew what I'd find before I even saw it. There in the center of the bed was Jessica, my wife, with Paul. They were tangled together under the sheets, their clothes discarded carelessly on the floor. Jessica didn't look like the woman I'd married in that moment. She looked like someone else entirely, someone who had chosen to betray everything we'd built. Paul looked up at me as the door swung open, his smirk infuriatingly intact. He didn't even flinch. "Michael," he said, as if we were old friends, as if this wasn't the scene of my marriage falling apart right in front of me. Jessica pulled the sheet up around herself, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. But it wasn't fear of being caught. It was something else. A flash of shame? Maybe, but not enough to wipe away the fact that she had come here willingly. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the air between us thick with everything unspoken. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears, my mind racing through all the ways this could go. I could yell, I could throw a punch, I could tear the whole place apart. But I didn't. Instead, I took a deep breath, the cold fury settling in my chest like a stone. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. Not yet. Get dressed, I said quietly, my voice dangerously calm. We're leaving. Jessica stared at me, her lips trembling as if she was going to say something, but I didn't care. I turned on my heel and walked out of the cottage, leaving the door wide open behind me. The weeks after the resort were a blur of careful planning and quiet execution. I didn't waste time wallowing in anger or hurt. I had bigger things to take care of. The moment we got back to Austin, I put my plan into motion, starting with a single phone call to David. And I went way back. He wasn't just any lawyer. He was sharp, methodical, and relentless. The kind of guy who could see through bullshit in a heartbeat and tear it apart with precision. He didn't flinch at dirty work, and I knew I'd need someone like him on my side if I was going to come out of this intact. Divorce was always ugly, but with the evidence I had, I knew we could turn this into a bloodbath for Jessica. The day of our meeting came quickly. David's office was tucked away in downtown Austin, all polished wood and glass with views of the city skyline. The air smelled faintly of leather and coffee when I walked in, and David was already sitting behind his desk, looking over a thick file when I arrived. He stood up, gave me a firm handshake, and motioned for me to sit. "Michael," he said, his voice steady, but with that usual edge of curiosity. "I hope you brought something interesting for me today." I set my phone down on his desk, unlocking it with a swipe. "More than interesting," I replied. "This should give us everything we need." He raised an eyebrow and leaned forward, watching as I pulled up the gallery. The photos and videos from the resort came into view, Jessica sneaking out of the room, walking toward Paul's cottage at dawn. The timestamp on the images was clear as day. I showed him the texts I'd found later, those coy, incriminating messages between Jessica and Paul. It wasn't just a one-time thing. They'd been planning this for days, maybe weeks, before we even stepped foot on that island. David's lips curled into a tight smile as he scrolled through the images, his eyes flicking between them and the notes he was already taking. "This is solid," he said. "Very solid. And that's not all," I added. I spoke with Amanda. She confirmed everything. Jessica went willingly. There was no coercion, no misunderstanding. She chose this. David nodded, leaning back in his chair, considering his next move. "With this," he said, "we can hit her hard. Full custody of the kids, the house, a significant financial settlement in your favor. Infidelity is still a powerful weapon in court, especially with this level of proof." "Good," I said, keeping my voice calm. "I want her out of the picture, David. Completely. She doesn't get to walk away from this like nothing happened." He studied me for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Are you sure you want to play it this way? Divorce is one thing, but what you're talking about is scorched earth. It'll get ugly." "I don't care," I replied without hesitation. "She crossed the line, and she doesn't get to come back from that." David gave a slight nod, understanding where I stood. "All right, then we go for everything. I'll start drafting the paperwork immediately. You'll have to play nice for now. Don't let her know what's coming." "She won't," I assured him. I had no intention of letting Jessica see this coming. At home, things had settled into a strange rhythm. Jessica had been surprisingly upbeat since we returned from the Keys. It was almost as if the entire betrayal had washed off her like rain, as if that morning in Paul's bed had never happened. She hadn't brought it up, and neither had I. It was a silent agreement between us, but I knew the storm was coming, and I'd be the one bringing it down. A few days after my meeting with David, Jessica sat across from me at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee. She glanced up, her eyes soft in a way I hadn't seen in months. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice tentative. "About what?" I asked, careful to keep my tone neutral. "About us. She set her cup down, pushing it aside as she leaned forward slightly. I know things haven't been great between us lately, and I know I've been distant, but I want to fix it. I've been thinking that maybe we should see a counselor. Work through things before it's too late. I stared at her, the nerve of her suggestion hanging between us. She really thought I didn't know, that I hadn't seen through every lie, every time she'd smiled at me and pretended like things were fine. But instead of showing my hand, I nodded slowly, as if considering her words. Counseling, huh? I said, tilting my head slightly. You think that'll help? She smiled faintly, clearly relieved that I wasn't outright rejecting the idea. I think it could. We've been through a lot, Michael. I don't want to lose us. The irony of her words nearly made me laugh, but I held it back. Instead, I leaned back in my chair, watching her closely. If you think it'll help, sure. I'm open to it. She reached across the table, her fingers grazing mine. Thank you, she whispered. We can find someone good. I know we can get back to where we were. I just nodded, letting her think she had some control over the situation. In reality, I was already miles ahead, every step already mapped out. Let her believe what she wanted. Counseling was a smokescreen, and I had no intention of salvaging this marriage. A week later, I was back in David's office, finalizing the paperwork. He handed me a thick stack of documents, the divorce petition front and center, everything meticulously detailed. Custody, assets, visitation rights. Everything was outlined, every angle covered. It was airtight. Once we file this, things will move quickly, David said, his voice calm but serious. Jessica's going to be blindsided. Good, I said, flipping through the papers. I want her to feel it. David nodded, sliding a few more forms toward me. One more thing. You'll need to get a psychological evaluation on her fitness as a mother. It's standard procedure, but with the infidelity and the lifestyle choices, we can argue that it's not in the kid's best interest to be with her full-time. Done, I said, signing the last page. Whatever it takes. As I left David's office that day, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. This was the calm before the storm, but for once, I wasn't afraid of what was coming. I was ready. Jessica had no idea what was about to hit her, and I wasn't going to give her the chance to get ahead of me. She thought she could play me, convince me to mend what was already shattered. But I had no intention of letting her rebuild anything. I was going to tear it all down, brick by brick, until there was nothing left for her to hold on to. The day I filed for divorce, the house felt eerily quiet. Jessica was out, probably at some cafe, pretending our life wasn't unraveling. I imagined her chatting with friends, spinning stories about how we were working through some things. She had no idea that the papers were already being processed, her little fantasy of fixing us about to collapse. By the time I got home from David's office, everything was in motion. The evidence, the case, the strategy, it was all a well-oiled machine. The weight of the decision didn't hit me like I thought it might. There was no second-guessing, no hesitation, just a grim certainty that this was the only way forward. A week later, Jessica found the envelope on the kitchen table. I'd left it there deliberately, not wanting to hand it to her directly. I watched from the doorway as she picked it up, her eyes narrowing as she saw the return address from David's firm. I didn't move, just leaned against the frame, waiting for the moment the truth would hit her. She opened it slowly, as if she already knew something was wrong. Her eyes skimmed over the first page, and then I saw the change, the way her breath caught, her face paling, her hands trembling slightly as the weight of it sunk in. "Michael," she whispered, looking up at me, her voice barely holding steady. "What is this?" "You know exactly what it is," I replied, my voice flat. There was no need to play games now. Her eyes darted back to the papers, her expression shifting from confusion to panic. "You filed for divorce?" she asked, incredulous. "Why? Why would you?" "I think you know why," I cut in, stepping closer. "Don't act like you don't." Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she dropped the papers onto the table and stood there, frozen, as if hoping this was some kind of nightmare she could wake up from. But this was real, and I wasn't about to back down. "Michael, we can fix this," she stammered, reaching out as if trying to grab hold of something that had already slipped through her fingers. "We can go to counseling like we talked about. You don't have to do this." I crossed my arms, my gaze unwavering. "Counseling?" I echoed. "You think that's going to fix what you did? What you chose to do?" Her face fell, the realization dawning that I wasn't playing along anymore. "It was a mistake," she said, her voice cracking. "It didn't mean anything. It was a stupid, terrible mistake, but we can move past it. Please, Michael, don't throw everything away." I let out a short, bitter laugh. "You really think this is about one mistake, Jessica? One night?" I stepped closer, watching her flinch slightly. "It wasn't just that night. It was every lie, every time you looked me in the eye and pretended everything was fine, all while sneaking around behind my back." Her eyes welled up with tears, and for a moment, she looked like the Jessica I used to know. The one I'd built a life with, the one I'd trusted. But that version of her was long gone. She'd buried it the moment she chose Paul, and I wasn't about to dig it up. "We can still fix this," she pleaded, her voice breaking now. "Please just don't do this to us. Don't do this to the kids." I shook my head, feeling the cold, hard resolve settle in my chest. "I'm doing this for them. You're the one who destroyed us." A few days later, Jessica had lawyered up. David had warned me she would. Said she'd scramble for someone fierce, someone who'd fight like hell to claw back whatever she could. He wasn't wrong. Her lawyer, Ellen, was everything David had anticipated. Sharp, experienced, and ruthless. I knew from the first moment we stepped into that family courtroom that she wasn't here to make any kind of peace. This was war for her, and I was the enemy. We sat on opposite sides of the room, the tension thick between us as the case unfolded. Jessica was trying to stay composed, but I could see the cracks forming, the way her hands shook slightly when she thought no one was looking. Ellen leaned over, whispering to her, probably trying to boost her confidence, but it wasn't going to be enough. David was meticulous in his presentation. He laid everything out piece by piece. The timeline of the affair, the texts, the photographs, even Amanda's testimony. It was a masterclass in dismantling Jessica's image, pulling apart the facade she'd built up around herself. Ellen, of course, tried to counter. She argued that it was a one-time lapse in judgment, that Jessica had been overwhelmed with work, that she had made a mistake but still deserved to have equal custody, to keep the house, to walk away without losing everything. But David didn't let up. "This isn't about a single mistake," he told the judge, his voice calm but firm. "This is about a pattern of behavior, a choice that wasn't made in the heat of the moment, but deliberately. This isn't someone who made a one-time error. This is someone who abandoned her responsibilities, who put her own desires ahead of her family, and who continues to show disregard for the well-being of her children." I glanced at Jessica as he spoke, watching her struggle to keep her composure. She looked pale, almost sickly, as if she was finally beginning to understand the gravity of what was happening. The judge, an older woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, listened intently, her eyes shifting between David and Ellen as the arguments went back and forth. Ellen tried to soften Jessica's actions, spinning them as a brief misstep, something that could be repaired with time. "Mrs. Harris," Ellen said, addressing the court, "has always been a devoted mother. Her mistake, though regrettable, should not overshadow years of commitment to her family. She deeply regrets her actions and is committed to being a responsible and loving mother moving forward." David didn't miss a beat. He stood, pacing slowly as he laid out the final blow. Devoted mothers don't put their children second to an affair. They don't walk out on their family for their own selfish desires. And they certainly don't expect to be rewarded for it by walking away with half of what they didn't earn. I watched as the judge's expression shifted, her gaze landing squarely on Jessica. It was subtle, but I could see the shift in her demeanor. Less sympathy, more skepticism. Jessica's face was unreadable, but I knew she could feel it too. The tide was turning. After what felt like an eternity, the judge finally spoke. "I've reviewed the evidence presented by both parties," she began, her voice even but authoritative. "It's clear that the actions taken by Mrs. Harris have had a significant impact on this family, particularly the children. While the court acknowledges her desire to move past this incident, we must prioritize the well-being of the children above all else. Jessica stiffened in her seat. Her breath held as she waited for the final blow. I find that Mr. Harris has presented a compelling case for full custody. Additionally, given the circumstances of the affair and the impact it has had on the family dynamic, I see no reason to award spousal support beyond the standard child support payments. The words hit Jessica like a hammer. I saw it. The way her face crumpled, the color draining from her cheeks. She was trying to keep it together, but it was clear she hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to lose. Ellen muttered something to her, probably trying to soften the blow, but there was nothing she could say to fix this. Jessica had walked into this battle thinking she'd come out with something, maybe even with her pride intact. But she hadn't counted on the thoroughness of my preparation or the evidence I had stacked against her. As we left the courtroom, David gave me a small, satisfied nod. "Well done," he said. "You played this exactly right." I didn't say anything, just nodded in return. The battle wasn't over, but this round was mine. Jessica, for all her scrambling, was left reeling, blindsided by the efficiency of the attack. She had underestimated just how far I was willing to go. Outside the courthouse, I saw Jessica standing by the steps, her arms crossed, staring down at the ground. She looked up when I approached, her eyes red-rimmed, her face a mixture of anger and desperation. "Michael, please," she said, her voice trembling. "We don't have to keep doing this. We can settle, work something out, for the kids' sake." I stopped, keeping my distance. "You made your choices, Jessica. Now you have to live with them." Her lips trembled, and for a moment, I almost saw a flicker of the woman I used to know. But it was too late for that. Too much had been broken, and nothing she could say now would fix it. I walked away, knowing that this wasn't just about winning custody or securing the financial settlement. It was about reclaiming control over my life, over my future, and over the wreckage Jessica had left behind. And I wasn't going to let her take any more than she already had. The weeks following the courtroom showdown were a mix of quiet satisfaction and calculated moves. Jessica had been rattled, there was no doubt about it. The shock of losing the custody battle, the house, and any real hope of financial security had left her scrambling for something to hold on to. But I wasn't about to let her regain her footing. Not after what she'd done. I began working behind the scenes, ensuring that the details of her betrayal slowly trickled through our shared social circles. Not in an obvious way. No, that would have been too blunt, too crude. Instead, I let little pieces of information slip in conversations with friends, the kind of details that would spread naturally like wildfire, igniting gossip among people who thrived on scandal. I'd mention the affair casually when meeting for drinks or while chatting with colleagues at an industry event. A few pointed comments about why the marriage ended was enough to get the rumors swirling. People didn't need much to fuel their curiosity, and once they had it, they ran with it. Within days, Jessica's name had become a quiet whisper at the cocktail parties, brunches, and business dinners we used to attend together. Friends we had shared for years began to distance themselves from her, unsure of how to navigate the wreckage of what she'd done. She didn't seem to notice it at first. She'd still try to make plans with them, probably thinking she could repair her image by staying social, by pretending everything was normal. But it didn't take long for her to realize she was being shut out. One morning, I overheard her on the phone, her voice shaky as she tried to confirm plans with one of our mutual friends, Sarah, I think. I could hear the awkward pauses on the other end of the line, the excuses about being busy with the kids or just needing some time. The color drained from Jessica's face as the conversation dragged on, her usual confidence faltering. It was satisfying, in a cold, detached way, to see her unraveling. I knew that feeling all too well. I'd felt it myself when I stood in Paul's cottage, watching everything I'd built come crumbling down. But this time, it wasn't me on the receiving end of the destruction. It was her. Meanwhile, my relationship with Emily and Max grew stronger by the day. They were still young, but they weren't blind to the changes happening around them. They didn't ask too many questions about the divorce, and I kept things as simple as I could. I made sure to spend as much time with them as possible, taking them out to the park on weekends, playing board games after dinner, even helping them with their homework late into the evening. I wanted them to feel secure, to know that no matter what was happening between me and Jessica, They were still the most important thing in my life. I could see the difference it made in them. Emily, who had been quiet and withdrawn during the worst of the fighting, started to smile more. Max, ever the rambunctious one, had seemed confused at first, but once I reassured him that he'd be staying with me, his energy returned. The house had become a sanctuary for them, a place of calm stability in the midst of the storm. Jessica, on the other hand, was falling apart. She'd call at odd hours, trying to arrange times to see the kids. At first, I played along, agreeing to joint custody visits. But the court ruling had been clear. Full custody was mine, and I wasn't about to let her use the kids to manipulate her way back into my life. After a few visits, it became clear that she was struggling. She'd show up late, disheveled, her once perfectly put-together appearance slowly deteriorating. The guilt, the isolation, and the loss of control were taking their toll on her, and I wasn't going to do anything to stop it. It wasn't long before she started pushing harder. I could see the desperation in her eyes every time she picked up Emily or Max. The way she lingered by the door, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I stayed distant, polite but firm, making it clear that any attempt to discuss us was off limits. But one night, she crossed the line. It was a Friday evening, the kids were staying with my parents for the night, and I was at home, enjoying the rare quiet when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I opened the door, there she was, Jessica. She looked different. Gone was the woman who had always seemed so composed, so in control. Her hair was slightly unkempt, her eyes tired, and there was something frantic in the way she stood, as if she had nowhere else to go. "Michael," she said softly, almost pleading, "can we talk?" I stared at her for a moment, debating whether to just shut the door in her face, but something in me told me to hear her out. I stepped aside, letting her in. She walked past me, her movements uncertain, as if she wasn't sure what she was doing here either. She stood in the living room, looking around at the familiar space, the home we'd once shared. "I've been thinking a lot," she began, wringing her hands. "About us. About what happened." I said nothing, letting her speak. "I know I hurt you," she continued, her voice wavering. "I know I made mistakes, but we had something, Michael. We built a life together. We can't just throw that away." I crossed my arms, watching her carefully. "What are you trying to say, Jessica?" She stepped closer, her eyes locking onto mine, and that's when I saw it. The desperation, the fear of losing everything. "I don't want to lose you," she whispered. "I made a mistake, yes, but we can fix this. We can work through it. I still love you." I almost laughed at the irony, but I kept my face neutral. I knew what she was doing. She wasn't here because she truly wanted to make things right. She was here because she had nothing left. The walls were closing in on her, and this was her last attempt to claw her way back. Before I could respond, she moved closer, her hand reaching up to touch my arm. "We don't have to let this end like this," she said, her voice softening, trying to be seductive. "We can start over." She leaned in, her breath warm against my neck, and I felt her lips graze my skin. It was a pathetic, desperate move, one that might have worked months ago when I still thought there was something worth saving. But not now. I stepped back, her hand falling to her side. "Jessica, stop," I said, my voice firm. "This isn't going to work." Her eyes widened, a flicker of panic crossing her face. "Michael, please. We can." "No," I interrupted, cutting her off. "It's over. You lost Jessica. You lost the kids, the house, everything. You can't fix this with sweet words or old memories. It's done." She stood there, staring at me, the weight of my words finally sinking in. I could see the cracks forming, her once unshakable confidence shattering piece by piece. "You did this to yourself," I added, my voice cold. "Now you have to live with it." For a moment, she didn't move. She just stood there, frozen in place, her face pale, her lips trembling as if she was going to say something, but she didn't. Instead, she turned and walked toward the door, her shoulders slumped, defeated. I watched her leave, the door closing softly behind her, and for the first time in a long while, I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a hollow satisfaction. The courtroom had the same sterile feel it always did, Polished floors, worn leather chairs, the faint scent of disinfectant lingering in the air. But today, there was something different about it. Something heavier. It was the final day. The last battle. I sat at the long wooden table, my hands resting calmly in front of me, my face a mask of composure. David was beside me, his eyes sharp and focused as he reviewed the last set of documents. Across the room, Jessica sat with Ellen. She looked different from the woman I once knew. Her hair slightly disheveled, her shoulders tense, eyes hollow. She was nervous. I could see it in the way she fidgeted with her pen, glancing at Ellen for reassurance. But there was nothing Ellen could do to save her now. Not today. David had prepared thoroughly for this hearing. There was no room for error, no weak points in our strategy. We'd torn apart every argument Ellen had tried to build over the last few weeks. Every piece of evidence, every emotional plea from Jessica, none of it had been strong enough to counter what I had brought to the table. It was almost over. The judge entered, and the room fell into a tense silence. She took her seat at the bench, her eyes scanning the documents in front of her one last time. I didn't need her to say anything to know which way the ruling would go. It was all written in her expression, the way her gaze lingered on Jessica, and the way her pen hovered over the final decision. The court has reviewed the evidence from both parties, the judge began, her voice steady but firm. It is clear that the actions taken by Mrs. Harris have not only damaged the stability of this family, but they have also shown a lack of responsibility toward the children's well-being. Given the overwhelming evidence of neglect, infidelity, and disregard for the children's needs, I am ruling in favor of Mr. Harris for full custody. I glanced sideways at Jessica. Her face fell, the color draining from her cheeks as the words sank in. She didn't look at me. She just stared ahead, her hands gripping the edge of the table, white-knuckled, as if bracing for the next blow. As for the division of assets, the judge continued, flipping through the financial documents. Mr. Harris has demonstrated a significant contribution to the marital estate, and given the circumstances surrounding the dissolution of the marriage, I see no reason to award spousal support beyond what is necessary for child maintenance. A small, modest sum, enough for her to survive on, but nowhere near what she had expected, nowhere near what she thought she was entitled to. Jessica's eyes flicked toward Ellen, her face a mixture of shock and desperation. But Ellen didn't meet her gaze. She knew this was a losing battle. The judgment was clear, and there was nothing more she could do. I leaned back in my chair, my heart steady, my mind calm. I had won. Everything I set out to achieve, full custody, the house, control over the children's future, it was all mine now. Jessica had been stripped of everything she once held over me, and I could see the realization hit her like a tidal wave. This court is adjourned, the judge said, her gavel falling with a decisive crack. Jessica didn't move. She sat frozen, staring at the table, her breaths coming in shallow, unsteady gasps. Ellen muttered something to her, maybe offering a final word of comfort, but I didn't care. I didn't care what Jessica felt. Not anymore. This was her doing. This was the bed she had made, and now she had to lie in it. David packed up the papers, giving me a nod as we stood to leave. "Well done," he said quietly. "This couldn't have gone better." I nodded in return, feeling that cold satisfaction settle deeper in my chest. I had kept my children, my home, and I had taken everything from her in the process. But I wasn't done. Not yet. Outside the courtroom, the air was thick with the Texas summer heat, but it felt cool compared to the tension I had just walked away from. Jessica emerged a few minutes later, Ellen by her side, but this time she looked defeated, her face red from what I assumed were the tears she had been holding back. Her eyes met mine for just a moment, a silent plea behind them, but I didn't flinch. There was nothing left to say. I watched as she started toward her car, Ellen walking beside her, probably trying to console her, telling her how she could rebuild, how she could still start over. But she didn't realize that I wasn't finished with her yet. I pulled out my phone, dialing David as I watched Jessica drive away. "It's done," I said as soon as he picked up. "Good," David replied. "I'll get the final papers filed by the end of the day. One more thing," I added, my voice calm but firm. "The restraining order." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "You sure about that?" I'm sure, I said, watching the road where Jessica had disappeared. I don't want her anywhere near me or the kids unless it's strictly court-approved. David didn't question me. I'll have the paperwork drafted and sent over. She won't be able to come within 100 yards without approval. Good, I said, ending the call. It wasn't enough to take everything from her. I had to make sure she knew there was no coming back. She had burned our life to the ground, and now she would be forced to stay on the ashes alone. No contact, no chance to manipulate or beg for forgiveness. No more pulling at old memories to try and win her way back into our lives. She was done. Later that evening, as I sat on the back porch of my house, the kids playing quietly inside, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: peace. The legal battles, the constant tension, the weight of Jessica's betrayal. It had all been lifted, like a suffocating fog finally beginning to clear. I looked around at the home I had fought so hard to protect, the place that now belonged to me and the kids, and I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. Jessica had underestimated me from the start. She had thought she could cheat, lie, and manipulate her way through life without consequence. But she had never understood what it meant to truly lose. She had lost everything: her family, her home, her reputation. And now, with the restraining order in place, she had lost any chance of ever being part of my life again, except on my terms. That cold satisfaction settled deeper in my chest as the thought lingered. She had gambled everything, and I had made sure she paid the price. As I sat there, the sun dipping below the horizon, I heard the faint sound of Emily and Max laughing inside. It was a sound that had become rare during the chaos of the last few months, but now it was becoming more frequent. It was a sign that we were moving on, that we were healing. And as for Jessica, she was just a distant memory, a cautionary tale of what happens when you betray everything you once held dear. I took a long, slow breath, feeling the weight of finality settle over me. It was done. I had won, and there was no going back. Thank you for listening to this story. Subscribe to the channel, put a like under the video, and write a comment about how you like this story.